Spectators.
911, what's your emergency?
It's the trainer. Something's wrong. He's not resurfacing after the interaction in the main tank.
Is she visible? Is she breathing?
No, she's still underwater. There's blood. He's not letting go. Please send help now.
The camera opens on the thunder of applause. Children wave foam fins in the air, parents raise their phones, and under the Florida sun, the water shimmers like a perfect mirror. SeaWorld promises wonder an arena where humans and whales dance as one. But on this afternoon in 2010, the illusion cracked. A trainer stood poised at the pool's edge, smile steady, every move rehearsed. Across from her, 22 feet of raw muscle drifted in silence, a black and white shadow gliding beneath the surface. Spectators leaned forward, expecting another breathtaking leap. Instead, they were about to witness a moment that would alter the conversation about captivity forever. What happened wasn't an accident. It was the breaking point of a system. It was the breaking point of a system that had ignored warning after warning. A collision between trust and confinement, passion and profit, and once it began, nothing could pull it back. For decades, orcas have been sold as smiling performers, but they are also apex predators, weighing 12,000 pounds, capable of killing in seconds. Trainers build their lives on faith that respect and routine will keep the peace. But what happens when that faith is betrayed? This is not just the story of a single tragedy. It is the story of a warning repeated and silenced until the silence itself became deadly. But behind the gasps and the glass walls, this wasn't just about one violent moment. It was about the woman who had built her life around these animals. Long before her name filled headlines, Brancheau was a girl who couldn't look at the ocean without feeling pulled into its mystery. While classmates passed summer days at the mall, she sat by aquariums sketching dorsal fins, memorizing whale dialects, practicing the sounds of dolphin clicks, until her family laughed at the uncanny mimicry. By 16, she was scrubbing algae from tanks, and she was peppering senior staff with questions few adults had ever asked. Professors remembered her as the student who not only excelled in biology, but also paused to imagine how the creatures she studied might feel. It was this instinct and empathy that went beyond textbooks that caught the attention of SeaWorld recruiters. A year out of college, Dawn was standing where she had always dreamed, on the pool deck, inches from predators most people only saw in picture books. She rose fast, not because she craved the spotlight, but because the animals responded to her in ways that unsettled even veteran trainers. Orcas tilted their massive heads toward her voice. They surfaced more smoothly, followed her hand signals with uncanny precision. Visitors began asking for her by name. Interns whispered that she had an unspoken language with the whales. Yet behind the admiration was a dangerous paradox. Every trick that thrilled the crowd required trust so absolute that one lapse, one unpredictable impulse could end everything. Dawn knew this better than anyone. Still, she believed the bond was real, that respect could bridge the gulf between species. Her devotion carried her to SeaWorld's grand stage, a place where spectacle disguised risk, and where one whale loomed larger than all the rest. Her gift wasn't just talent. It was devotion, a conviction that she and the whales were partners, not master and subject. But what happens when the very creatures she loved began to send signals that something inside them was breaking SeaWorld? Orlando wasn't just an amusement park. It was an empire built on the promise that humans could bring the ocean's most formidable predator onto a stage and choreograph its power into spectacle. Families filed through towering gates, past souvenir stands and tanks engineered to mimic the wild, and into a theater designed like a coliseum. Every leap, every splash was rehearsed until it looked like harmony. But behind the glittering surface, the reality was far more complicated. Among the collection of killer whales, one presence dominated them all. Tilikum, at 22 feet and 12,000 pounds, he dwarfed trainers and whales alike. Deep scars traced his flanks from battles with other males. Trainers described him with the same words used for troubled geniuses: brilliant, temperamental, unpredictable. And his history carried shadows the public was rarely told. Years earlier, at a marine park in Canada, a young trainer had drowned in a tank where Tilikum was present. Later in Orlando, the body of a trespasser was discovered draped across his back. Both incidents raised alarms, but each time the reports were filed away buried under bureaucracy and carefully worded press releases. To the paying audience, Tilikum remained the star attraction, the crown jewel of SeaWorld's brand. And in the weeks before the show, that giant began to change, sending signals that something deep inside him was breaking. It was an animal with a documented record of death still placed front and center day after day. In the weeks before that February afternoon, something inside Tilikum seemed to shift. Trainers noticed him hovering at the surface, motionless for long stretches as though detached from the choreography he once performed with precision. He sank resurfaced, but without the usual eager spark. More unsettling still, he began jaw-popping, slamming his jaws together in sharp, echoing claps, a behavior recognized in orcas as a display of dominance or agitation. Some trainers exchanged uneasy glances. A few logged the behavior, adding notes to a growing stack of incident reports. But shows were scheduled, tickets were sold, and Tilikum remained the headliner. For Dawn, these signs weren't unfamiliar. She had spent years studying the moods of the animals under her care. Still, even she couldn't know what storm might be building beneath the glossy surface of the pool. The morning of the show arrived bright and humid. Families shuffled into the amphitheater, chattering with anticipation. Backstage, Dawn tied her hair, zipped her wetsuit, and glanced through the glass where Tilikum circled slow, deliberate, his great black dorsal fin cutting through the water like a blade. On her clipboard, she ticked off the same pre-show checklist she had ticked off hundreds of times before. To the audience, it was another afternoon of wonder. To those closest to the tank, it was the calm before something unthinkable. The crowd cheered as Dawn guided Tilikum onto the stage platform, her arm extended in a familiar signal. To the audience, it was a seamless continuation of the show, but trainers along the sidelines noticed something: his movements lagged. His tail slapped harder than usual, sending deep vibrations across the water surface. Still, Dawn held her composure, her smile fixed. She leaned forward, coaxing him into the next routine. Then in an instant, the rhythm shattered. Tilikum dipped beneath the platform, vanishing into the blue. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the splash of his return, but he surfaced in the wrong spot and everything changed. Without warning, his jaws clamped down on Dawn's arm. In one violent pull, he yanked her into the depths. Gasps tore through the amphitheater. Some children clapped, thinking it was part of the act. Others screamed as the reality hit. This wasn't choreography. This was chaos. Beneath the surface, Dawn struggled against 12,000 pounds of raw power. Trainers rushed forward, frantically activating underwater tone generators, devices meant to disrupt an orca mid-attack. The alarm shrieked through the pool, but Tilikum didn't flinch. He dove again, dragging Dawn down with him, twisting, thrashing, holding her under. Seconds blurred into a minute into two. Emergency procedures unfolded in desperate waves. Staff scrambled to lower nets, close gates isolate the pool. One trainer shouted commands, holding out fish in a futile attempt to lure him away. But Tilikum ignored every cue. His grip was unrelenting. Witnesses saw him slam her against the glass, so violent her shoe floated free. Parents shielded their children's eyes, some frozen in their seats, others rushing for the exits. Trainers screamed orders, but the tank was no longer theirs. It belonged to him. Dawn fought with every ounce of strength, but against an apex predator, her body was a fragile silhouette tossed through churning water. 7 minutes of chaos ended in silence. What followed was the scramble to understand, to contain, and to explain the unexplainable. By the time staff managed to draw Dawn from the water, the amphitheater had fallen into stunned silence. The massive whale circled slowly as trainers knelt at poolside, pumping Dawn's chest, pressing breath into lungs that would not rise. Parents hurried their children out of the stands, their footsteps echoing against the concrete as the spectacle dissolved into dread. The clock read 2:41 p.m. when paramedics confirmed what no one wanted to believe: Dawn Brancheau was gone. In less than 7 minutes, a career built on discipline and devotion had ended violently in front of hundreds of witnesses. Trainers who had shared meals with her that morning now stood paralyzed, wetsuits, dripping faces ashen. For families on vacation, the dream became a nightmare burned into memory. SeaWorld moved quickly into lockdown. Barriers were pulled across the entrances. Shows canceled, staff ordered to keep silent. A single statement was prepared. We are deeply saddened to confirm the passing of one of our most experienced and beloved trainers. No questions taken, no explanations offered. Behind the glass walls of the tank, Tilikum floated quietly, the water around him eerily calm, as if nothing had happened. But investigators wasted no time. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration dispatched agents. Federal wildlife officials arrived to study hours of footage frame by frame. Internal logs were requested, records of close calls, ignored warnings, and troubling behavior that had accumulated over years. Within 48 hours, the medical examiner's report leaked to the press. The findings were brutal. Dawn had suffered blunt force trauma to her chest, neck, and abdomen. Several ribs shattered, a shoulder dislocated, pulmonary hemorrhaging filled her lungs. The official cause was drowning following prolonged submersion, but the examiner noted the trauma alone might have been fatal. The news broke like a tidal wave. Within days, television anchors repeated the same headline on loop: Orca kills veteran trainer. Clips of Dawn smiling through the crowd moments before the attack replayed beside shaky cell phone footage of the chaos that followed. Commentators debated, ethics experts warned of captivity's cost, and for the first time in decades, SeaWorld's carefully polished image began to crack in the public eye. Former trainers stepped forward with haunting admissions. One told reporters, "We'd been warning about Tilikum for years. His behavior was changing. No one wanted to listen." Another described filing incident reports that disappeared into filing cabinets, never reaching the public. What had once been whispered in break rooms was now broadcast on national networks. Outrage spilled into the streets. Protesters with handmade signs crowded SeaWorld's gates. Justice for Dawn, free, Tilikum shut down SeaWorld. Parents who had taken their children to the shows now questioned whether they had unknowingly supported cruelty. Flowers and photographs began piling against the entrance memorial part protest. And on social media, anger spread even faster. Hashtags trended worldwide, uniting animal rights activists with ordinary families who had simply seen enough. The question was no longer whether one trainer had made a mistake, it was whether the entire system was built on denial and danger. Outrage filled the streets, but the science told an even darker story. Captivity itself was reshaping the very minds of these predators. As protests swelled outside the park, scientists and behaviorists began speaking with a clarity the public hadn't heard before. Orcas, they explained, are not circus animals. They are wide-ranging predators that in the wild can travel up to 100 miles a day, weaving through currents, hunting in groups, and communicating in dialects unique to their pods. In tanks, instincts collapse, endless circles, echoes off glass, family bonds severed. Stress builds like pressure in a sealed chamber. Researchers described abnormal behaviors, whales grinding their teeth against steel gates, floating listlessly at the surface, even lashing out at one another. Some injuries were self-inflicted, others turned into aggression toward humans. Former consultants admitted they had warned SeaWorld that male orcas in particular often deteriorated psychologically in captivity, but those cautions rarely made it beyond closed doors. One marine behaviorist put it starkly, "We've underestimated them. Orcas, remember, they mourn, they strategize, and when frustration festers with nowhere to go, sometimes they lash out, not because they are monsters, but because they are sentient." For audiences who had grown up cheering these animals, the realization was devastating. The smiling routines on stage were not joy, they were survival under pressure. SeaWorld had no choice but to act. Within weeks of the tragedy, the park announced a sweeping halt to its signature routines. No more trainers riding dorsal fins, no more in-water stunts with the orcas. The shows would continue, but the human presence in the pool was gone. For the first time, the spectacle that had defined the brand was visibly broken. Trainers were reassigned to dry stage interactions, and a new department was quietly formed to study enrichment puzzle feeders, toys and exercises meant to keep the whales engaged without pushing them into dangerous contact. Consultants arrived, marine biologists, behaviorists, even critics who had once stood outside the gates with protest signs. They were brought in to redesign protocols from the ground up. On paper, it looked like reform, but to many, the timing felt hollow. Why did change have to wait until someone was dead? For Dawn's family, grief turned into a mission. They established the Dawn Brancheau Foundation, vowing that her name would not only be tied to tragedy, but to progress. Scholarships were created for young scientists, grants awarded to safety programs for animal handlers, and donations funneled toward conservation. At candlelight vigils, colleagues stood in wetsuits along the edge of the tank heads, bowed flowers drifting on the surface while Tilikum circled silently beneath. In the end, Dawn's death was not only a personal loss, it was a reckoning. Her story forced the public to look past the polished smiles and choreographed splashes to confront the uneasy truth behind the glass. Orcas are not stage props. They are sentient beings whose freedom was traded for applause, whose instincts were compressed into routines. The illusion of harmony had carried for decades, but on that February day, the curtain fell. Across the world, lawmakers took notice. Petitions gathered millions of signature bills, once stalled in committee, found new momentum, and families who had cheered in those stadium seats began asking whether wonder built on captivity was worth the price. Dawn's colleagues described her as someone who believed deeply in connection, that humans and whales could meet in trust rather than domination. But after her death, that very belief became the question haunting everyone who had watched. Can true connection exist in a cage built on control? SeaWorld would adapt. Policies shifted, shows changed, and eventually the orca breeding program itself was phased out. Yet the debate remains echoing in every documentary, every protest, every child asking why the whales are there at all. Dawn didn't die in vain. Her legacy became a mirror reflecting the cost of human pride and the possibility of human compassion. And as we decide how to treat the wild in our care, one question refuses to fade. Do we honor these creatures by keeping them close or by letting them live as nature intended? If this story made you pause, reflect, or question, let it be the beginning. Support marine conservation, share Dawn's legacy, and keep the conversation alive. And if you want more stories that matter, subscribe and stay with us. We're not done asking the hard questions.